Good evening. I'm Barkha. You're with the Mojo story. The Prime Minister has announced a very, very interesting and ambitious economic reform. The Modi government has decided to go ahead with a national monetization pipeline. Let's bring up our big story for our deep dive analysis today. 6 lakh crores of assets are going to be unlocked for value. This is part of the Modi government's new monetization pipeline. It will include assets from roads to railways, many infrastructural assets that will continue to be owned by government but will be available for private players to lease. Now, the government is zooming in on what it's calling underutilized assets. But the opposition is attacking the government scheme. Rahul Gandhi says this is India on sale, and this is a move that is designed to strengthen oligarchs and create a monopoly. Several economists, however, think that this is a very, very important economic reform. The ownership stays with the government, the finance minister has clarified. But what will be the revenue model once these assets are in fact unlocked? To discuss both the politics and the economics of this big government move and its possible impact on the economy, that will be a big focus on this broadcast today. So let's introduce our guests on the program today as we look at this ambitious economic reform that is being attacked by the opposition and being called legalized loot by parties like the Congress and the Trinamool Congress. Bringing up our guests on the program today, we're joined by Mitali Nikore, who's an economist. Welcome. We're also joined by Gurucharan, who is an economist, an author, a man of many parts. Welcome to the program. Next up is Professor Zico Dasgupta, an economist with the Azim Premji University. Dhiraj Nayyar is with us. He's the chief economist at the Vedanta group, has also worked with the Niti Aayog, which will be a nodal agency for this scheme to actually roll out. And Sunil, Alagh, entrepreneur and managing director of SKS Advisors, is with us as well. Let me start with you, Gurucharan. This is a very sort of interesting proposal and one that even economists who have worked with previous governments have welcomed. But is there something that makes your alarm bells go up? You know, when Rahul Gandhi says this is India on sale, when economists like Kaushik Basu says welcome move, but how do you stop it from emboldening oligarchs? What would you say, Gurucharan?
Well, I think this is a significant reform. And this is exactly the kind of thing that we need. Now, the problem, of course, is in the execution. And my real fear is that with the background of PPPs in the past, we have the private sector will be very shy of going in for this, unless, I mean, the whole thing will be the contracts that they will create. And in the last time around, the contracts were not fair. They were heavily weighted in favor of the state, and therefore a lot of people lost a lot of money. And in fact, today's NPAs, a lot of the NPAs today, you know, this mess that we have carried for 10 years, this is, some of these are these infrastructure PPAs.
So you don't have a problem with the policy. You don't think it will be attractive enough for the private sector. You're coming to this from a totally different perspective.
Yeah, no, I think that it is a terrific thing to do. The whole world goes about doing things. It's a sensible way to move ahead. The only problem, I mean, Rahul Gandhi's remark yesterday is typical of an economic illiteracy in our country, whereby when you start seeing this sort of thing as national assets on sale, you know, you really wonder the failure of our reformers to have sold the reforms. People can't differentiate, like Rahul Gandhi, between being pro-market and pro-business. And so,
how do you respond to his criticism? You're seeing his quote on the screen that this will benefit only 3 or 4 big business houses. This is the same argument that was applied to the farm legislations as well. Gurucharan.
Right. Yeah, and I think that this is wrong. And there are a lot of good infrastructure companies that will come forward. And my fear is that the very best ones would be very shy, unless if the contracts are good and fair and clean and world class. There's no reason why lots of people will not come in. There are a number of very good infrastructure companies that will come in. It's the reality is that you have to, in India, insulate from political risks. The comments like the one that Rahul Gandhi made. You have to and the second thing is that we need independent regulators. Unfortunately, many regulators are themselves incompetent.
Right.
And I mean, look at the case of the privatization of the railway, the trains. The private trains that were put for sale a
Mhm.
couple of months ago. Nobody in the private sector bid for it because there isn't an independent regulator that they can trust. The person was a retired railway official. And if you have these kinds of people, retired IAS officials and all that, who have no clue about really how these things happen in the world today, and
Okay.
and and
So
that's where I worry
yeah.
is.
So you think it's a terrific reform, but too much government, too much bureaucracy could ruin it again. Not enough specific incentives for the private sector. Past experiences don't hold up great examples. Sunil, Alagh, is the problem too much government and too little? And when you see the opposition kind of charging against this reform as being pro-oligarchy, and I saw a similar sort of comment from Kaushik Basu, who used to be, chief economic advisor in the UPA government, and certainly not anti reforms, saying it's a welcome reform, but you've got to guard against the oligarchs. What would you say, Sunil?
No, I think that question of oligarchy just come up now because of the IT, the phone bit now. Otherwise, nobody talked about it. See, all the airports are so much better now. There's no question. Bombay, Delhi, you name it, because it's gone managed by the private sector. Therefore, it's pretty good. See, Rahul Gandhi's remark will only get unions in all the public sector units to come up and say, look, because their jobs are secure, whether they work or not, whether the company makes a profit or not, they stay where they are. The moment the private sector comes in, you have to do things. Now, the important part that we have to realize is that, look, where are they going to get the money that they have been spending because of COVID? They have to now, they have been forced to sell in a manner, move this. It's a great economic measure. The Congress government, governments of the past have all hung on to it because the unions have stepped in. But today is the best time because otherwise your taxes are bound to go up if they don't get it. Now, the only thing that the government has to avoid in all this, if you ask me, is that look, they cannot have LIC bidding because if LIC takes it over or they come in as the strong bidder, then it's money going from one part of the government to the other part. So they have to avoid all that. It has to get into the private sector. When they're talking about leasing, leasing means the ownership for 20 years or 30 years if they lease it, the ownership will remain with the Indian government, but they will have no interference in running it, just like airports and all. I don't think the land is taken over. Like we had factories which were leased by the port trust to us. And once the 50 years is over, then the lease rent goes up. That's all. But they never interfered in the running. So the question that he is raising, whatever Rajiv Gandhi is selling the assets, the government does not run businesses. Even if what you call the Navratans, it doesn't mean just because they're making profits, they're well run. Maybe the private sector will make more money and make it run it more efficiently. That's what we have to see. And therefore,
Okay.
when selling it, I don't think there's going to be the kind of problems, and they have to avoid a monopoly. There's no question of just two parties running almost the nation, and if he's anticipating a lot more than what is actually going to happen, if you ask me.
Right. So avoid a monopoly, but otherwise, economic illiteracy is how Gurucharan and Sunil seem to view the opposition's comments. Let me bring in Zico now, Professor Zico Dasgupta at the Azim Premji University. Zico, do you have a different way of seeing this? Is there any merit in the opposition argument that this is a kind of handing over of the crown jewels? That's the phrase that has been used by the Congress to a bunch of 3 to 4 business houses. Zico.
I think beyond what the opposition is saying, I think we must get the context right. I think we are having this debate in a very specific context, and the context pertains that we are confronting an impossible trilemma. The impossible trilemma pertains to the following: that there is a challenge to stabilize the debt GDP ratio, there is a challenge to increase expenditures, to invoke recovery, to trigger recovery to a substantial extent, and third, to maintain the existing financial structure and revenue generation framework. And this is an impossible trilemma. One can't have all the three. And this is surely a policy, and this has been reflected, be it in the budget documents or in the Niti documents, that this policy is essentially trying to resolve this impossible trilemma. And I think there are two questions which are related to this. First, does it resolve this impossible trilemma? Can it help to a large extent in the economic recovery? That's question A. Question B is that are there better alternatives? The answer to the first question, I would say that I would be largely skeptical for two or three distinct reasons. First, one needs to think about the net amount which the government is getting. Because of course the government might get 6 lakh crores or might not, but at the most it would get 6 lakh crores. But precisely because it's a monetization of rights, and it's rights, and one is also letting go of future generation of income, which the government would have otherwise earned.
Explain that. What do you mean is letting go of future generation of income? Give me an example.
So think of $100 billion or say 10 lakh rupees of assets which the government has. And what the government wants to do is to hold on to say 5 lakhs and then want to lease out the right on the rest of the 5 lakh rupees.
Yeah.
But all the assets generate certain amount of income, right? There is a rate of return involved with every bit of asset that we are talking about. So the moment there is a transfer of the rights, one is also providing the revenue generation, flow of revenue generation to the private sector, but that would have otherwise been incurred by the government. That's how the revenue generation is.
Yeah, but by definition, and I'll let Dhiraj come in on this maybe as a response, by definition, Dhiraj, the government would argue that these are underutilized assets. So they were never actually providing the revenue at an optimal level. Zico, sorry, do you want to respond to that? And then I'll ask Dhiraj to come in. Yeah, Zico?
Yeah, I haven't finished my point. So that was the first, that we don't know the net amount. That's not clear to us. Second, involves the pricing question, that what happens to the prices of the strategic sectors once this policy had been implemented. The third issue is that one is essentially talking about 15% of the entire financing pattern of the capital expenditures, because the rest will be financed by other resources. So if the issue is about reducing the interest rate, the terms of concessions or the terms of interest rate as far as financing capital expenditure is concerned, one is essentially talking about a substantially small amount. And this would, if you give me time, one can think about the alternatives to this.
Okay, let me come back, because your argument is again not on principle. It's basically saying that there isn't enough revenue generated that would have accrued to the government otherwise. Mitali, the opposition, however, is arguing from a point of principle, from a philosophical difference with this. And we do also have past sort of experiments, which, as Gurucharan has reminded us, with these experiments that haven't gone particularly well. Your take?
So, Barkha, I just want to take 2 minutes to, agree with both Gurucharan and Zico on different aspects. So, Dr. Das, I totally agree with him that at the end of the day, governments don't have a role in infrastructure to the extent that private sector does in terms of operating the assets. Ownership should remain with governments, as we say from basic economic principles, because at the end of the day, these are natural monopolies. You don't want to sell off your country's ports. That is, the income that should accrue to the entire country and be redistributed by the government. So therefore, there is a logic to the ownership being with the government and private sector operating because they are more efficient. That is on principle. But in our country, the experience has been that railway sector has hardly been privatized till now. And even in the road sector, there have been a lot of NPAs. When we come to ports, there are only 2 or 3 firms which have the capacity to actually bid for these large projects. Yeah. So, there's a difference between the theoretical and, as Zico is saying, the practical, that, where do we end? And what we can do with the contracting is where we can actually safeguard the interest of the common person. In the contracting, conditions can be built in very easily based on global best practices to make firms be accountable towards inclusive development and to
Okay.
make firms be accountable towards climate resilient infrastructure development.
And I'll come to that because that's detailing. But on principle, Mitali, do you have a problem or do you support this move? And then, sorry, Dhiraj, I meant to come to you and I'll come to you right after Mitali answers that. Mitali?
No,
on principle?
On principle of disinvestment is fine, but implementation is very, very important. Are we maximizing the value of these assets and are we accounting for climate change when it comes to these assets? These are two very big questions which remain unanswered.
Okay, Dhiraj, the criticism from those who have criticized it has again and again been about monopolies, about the creation of monopolies. Mitali makes the point that it may be open to all, but in actuality, you will end up with the same clutch of 3 to 4 business houses, and therefore the alarm bells going up about a possible emboldening of oligarchs, as it were. How would you respond to that, Dhiraj? Yeah, I think Dhiraj is frozen. Gurucharan, do you want to take that?
No, yeah, I don't understand, where this.
Sorry, Dhiraj, are you back? Because we couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Are you back? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm
Okay, I'm going to ask you to reconnect because you have a terrible line.
I just wanted.
And Gurucharan, I'm going to ask you the same question. How do you guard against monopolies?
Yeah, I think it's always a good idea. I mean, the whole market principle is based on competition. And we've found in studies have shown that actually if 2 or 3 players are present in any market, that's sufficient for competition. Of course, you don't want those same 2, 3 players in every market,
Yeah, so, and that has been the apprehension raised by left-leaning economists and the opposition.
Yeah, so the one way is really to set within a particular area, say airports, that no particular company will have more than a certain share of the airport market. Or if it is ports, no one will have more than a certain share. But just be mindful that 2 or 3 players, even in the Competition Commission, I'm an advisor to the Competition Commission, 2 to 3 players in a market, in a company, in an economy where I was competing, Procter & Gamble competing on soaps with Lever and Henkel, they would kill each other in the market to get 1% more market share. So that's fine. The whole old idea, the old principle of MRTP there was wrong. But reality is, as a country, we don't want 2, 3 guys to own everything. And so I think there are ways. They should consult the Competition Commission law to see what is the best practice in this regard in the world. And you could put a cap on each industry, whether it's railways or airports or
but
wherever.
even sectors, Dhiraj, I hope you're back. Even sectors where there hasn't been government ownership, it hasn't been PPE. Let's say look at telecom. You have actually seen a consolidation as opposed to many players surviving. Gurucharan says 2 or 3 players is enough to keep healthy competition as long as it's not the same 2 or 3 players in every sector. But in India, there's a very real danger that it could be the same 2 or 3 business houses in every sector. Dhiraj, go ahead. Dhiraj? Okay, I don't know what's happening with Dhiraj's line today.
In theory, it could be, but I don't see that happening in practice.
Yeah. Go ahead. We can hear you.
Hear me?
Yeah.
No, I was saying in theory, yes, it's possible. It's possible that 1 or 2 business houses corner everything. I just recall the airport privatization which happened under UPA. GMR and GVK, which were the 2 companies which won Delhi and Mumbai respectively, were unknown companies. I mean, they were up against the Bhartis of the world and other major infrastructure companies, including foreign investors, and they came up. So this actually gives an opportunity for newer players, newer infrastructure players to get a foothold. And it's not the case that one company or two companies will have an interest across all these sectors. I think that's also putting it, and I don't think that's happened. Asset monetization is not new. It has happened in roads for a long many years, airports for a long many years. So I don't think this fear is necessarily very well founded. And I just wanted to make one comment on the organized loot part. For me, the only organized loot that has happened over time is of our public sector companies by the government. All of them have, far from being family jewels, are basically junk. From 10 years ago, you look at the way the Sensex has gone, a meteoric rise, and you look at the PSU index, including the star companies, the Coal Indias, the NTPCs, has gone exactly downwards in that same period of time. So who's looting what is the question I'd like to ask. Whereas the 12 companies which were actually privatized during the Vajpayee government have actually shown great improvement. So I think, and those are actually asset sales. This is only leasing assets. When you're selling a company, you're actually selling the entire asset. So I think what is being looted. Government is not a good manager and not a good runner of any kind of projects. We know that. The only thing is that we also know that when the earlier PPPs were done, the private sector took on a lot of risks, as Gurucharan I think mentioned earlier, and a lot of fingers were burned. So the sensible way is for the government to build and then monetize so that it can build more. India has not built yet. Rather than sale of assets, I would say this is an exercise in building India, building more assets for India. If there's one place where India lags China and or the other emerging economies in Asia, it's on our quality of infrastructure. And I think the only way you can build it is by investing more money, monetizing your existing assets, or as I think Sunil Alagh said, you have to raise taxes. And that has its own terrible consequences for growth. So I think this whole concept of sale of assets, loot, it's very misplaced.
I just wonder if someone wants to take on Zico Dasgupta's point. Sunil, you may have missed a part of it, is that the revenue that would have accrued to the government will now go to private players. And Zico, do you want to just make that point a little more sort of sharply, and I'll get people to respond to it. What is your biggest concern? You're saying there isn't enough revenue, is what I'm hearing, to set the books right.
There has to be a cost-benefit analysis. One needs to be clear what one is getting at. If the idea is to relax government finances, there has to be a cost-benefit analysis. The government, what it is earning and what it is letting go. That's one, and we don't know that. Second is related to the valuation question as well, and the entire questions of monopoly. Precisely because when the government is getting the money and one is letting go the foregone future, one is foregoing the future kind of income generation. It's related to the valuation. How much money the government is getting related to the values of the assets. There has to be a transparent communication of that.
Okay, Gurucharan, you wanted to briefly respond, and then Sunil Alagh. Gurucharan?
Well, Sunil is, I think, on the same page. Basically, look, he says there's no evidence. We don't know. But the reality is, look at 70 years of the public sector and what returns it has yielded for the Indian people. Look at that versus the rest of the economy. Dhiraj just gave you an example of from the last 10 years of the Sensex, public sector companies' returns versus non-public sector companies' returns. What kind of evidence are you looking for? The government is not in the business of doing business. The government should be in the business for doing governance. And today, where the government is letting us down is precisely in governance. So, I'm afraid to go near a police station. I'm afraid to see, why should my case in the court take 15 years? That's the job of the state to do, not run businesses.
Okay, Zico, briefly, and then Sunil Alagh, very briefly. Zico?
One is talking in the context of this recession. What one needs to explain that why the government or the macro economy is not reviving from 2017 fourth quarter. If Professor Singh's argument is that the economy can revive on its own without government expenditure, either Professor Singh Professor Gurucharan must explain that why he is opposed to government's policy of increasing government expenditures, because that's what the laissez-faire would lead to.
Okay, I understand what you're saying, and let me get Sunil Alagh and the others to respond to it. That in the end, there is no escaping the fiscal deficit increasing, because the way to tackle this recession is going to have to be more government spending, and by simply leasing out assets, you can't escape that. Sunil, go ahead, take that.
Look, as what Gurucharan has said is that, look, we have to look for returns, and therefore all the companies, the only thing which we have to avoid are twofold. I've said it in the beginning. don't have another government company which outbids another private sector company, and then it's money from one person to the other person. Okay, so that's like LIC or anyone bidding and then getting it in. So can you hear me now? I don't know. I'm seeing some.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you. Go ahead.
So therefore, all I'm saying is that look, you got an MRTP Act which the government must reinforce or redo in a manner where they are protected. So the Competition Act, for instance, when they are now moving in and saying if 4 or 5 companies get together and form a cartel on pricing, they're being penalized. So therefore, government has enough controls with it to manage all this. Now, I'm not saying, somebody said only 2 companies. I say a minimum of 3 companies should be there. Otherwise, just 2 companies could get together and price everybody else out. Now, that should be avoided, but 3 companies is good enough. As long, even if you have 50% of the market share, for instance, I'm on the board of United Breweries, we might have enough of market share, but there are 4 other companies which can take it away. And that's what keeps everyone on their toes, as Gurucharan has pointed, in terms of Premji and levers and everybody else. They're on their toes because they fight like mad in the market, and the consumer ultimately gains. Out of efficiency, it's about time the unions have realized that they cannot remain in jobs, and that is what the pressure will be on the government when the unions come in and say we are going on strike if you privatize. And that is where Rajiv Gandhi is helping that concept rather than saying, no, this is new India now. 70 years the government has had the opportunity, whether it's BJP or whether it's Congress or anybody, and they've not done a good job. So it's about time you give somebody else a chance now. And therefore, I'm against anyone who says don't do it.
Yeah. Mitali?
Thanks, Barkha. So, I just wanted to come in and make the point about the fact that I think, the big challenge that everybody who's opposing this is facing is trying to understand whether there will be a redistributive impact of the money that is raised. If you're raising 6 lakh crores, are you using it for social protection to help the poor who have been impacted by the pandemic? For example,
but the argument would be that it's adding to the government coffers, and then the government will decide based on policy how that money is to be spent. Why does there have to be a direct reallocation of the money raised from this on a specific thing that you think is appropriate?
So the point here, Barkha, is that what kind of growth do we want to aspire for, right? Do we want to aspire for higher GDP, but at the cost of higher GDP, are we giving up the welfare of the poor? Right?
Okay.
And that's exactly what Zico is saying, that if you did a cost-benefit analysis to make sure that wherever you are investing then, the resources that are raised through disinvestment, I'm not opposed to disinvestment. My point is about use of proceeds. Right?
Okay, hang on. I can see both Dhiraj and Sunil wanting to respond to you. I'll go with Dhiraj first and then Sunil. Go ahead, Dhiraj.
My point is that it should absolutely not be redistributed in terms of subsidies and wasteful welfare. It should be invested in building more infrastructure, because that is productive spending, and that's what will create jobs. I mean, we have to decide, are we a dole economy or are we a job creating economy? I mean, we can keep everybody on dole and be happy about it, or we create jobs for that many more people. For that, you need to create infrastructure, you need to have investment, you need to, build the economy. And in fact, my view is that this is the more timid part of the government's agenda. The more aggressive part is actually the disinvestment of PSUs, where you're actually selling the whole asset. Here you're only leasing the asset. After 30 years, it comes back to the government. So I actually don't see any controversy in this at all. In fact, as Gurucharan said earlier, the only controversy in this is it may not take off if you don't frame the term attractive enough for the private sector.
Mitali briefly, and then Sunil. Mitali briefly. I've got let Mitali respond.
Dhiraj, I'm not disagreeing with that at all. I totally am in favor. If you feel that disinvesting PSUs will make much more, will unlock value for the economy and for the taxpayer, absolutely fine with it. But then the problem is that when we are designing government expenditures, as again Dr. Das said, government should be there where government is required. And government is required to deal with the fact that women are not, participating in the workforce. The fact that there is discrimination against minorities, against, so many disadvantaged social groups.
What would you like to see? You would like to see a commitment that the revenue from this is used in ABC way? I mean, we don't say that. We don't say that for every other economic move.
We say that for most of the economic moves, Barkha, where we say that more transparency and expenditures.
That's fine.
Of where government
Okay,
expenditure.
Sunil, jump in. Sunil.
Criticizing this government for looking after only the poor, which they must. So there's no way in which they are going to stop looking after the middle income group, which has been left out for the last couple of years. They are the ones who are facing inflation. They are the ones who are getting their taxes paid. They are the ones who are actually being affected. So this fear of not being spent on the poor is out of the question as far as I'm concerned, because the government has been spending a lot of money on the poor. In fact, they've been giving them free food during COVID. They've been giving them all kinds of moves, and they've left out the middle income group. So that criticism, will they spend on the poor, is really, I mean, not bearing out in the facts that the government has in the last 3 years. So they need the money. They need it to continue with their efforts on the poor, and they need to now give relief to the middle income group, which actually makes things move. I mean,
I need to take
right now you have to create demand.
Yeah, Zico.
It's the people who have the money,
Yeah, Zico. Last remarks. I'll start with you, Zico.
2 points. Number one, if one is, what is the target? If the target is economic recovery and maintain stabilization plans, then one needs to have a rigorous analysis what the government is getting and what one is letting it go. It's not an abstract point of one is talking about. And the government has not clearly communicated what one is getting and what one is letting it go. That's one. That will be clearly communicated. And if the benefit is less than the cost, then it must be stopped. But for that, we need to know what we are talking about. That's one. Second, are there better alternatives? Surely it does. RBI, in its recent analysis, has talked about high multiplier values of capital expenditures, which basically tells about that capital expenditures can finance itself. In other words, capital expenditure, if it is increased to a substantial amount, it will increase output to an extent that maintains the same debt GDP ratio. That's what RBI would talk about. If the government is opposed to that, it might be the case that their analysis is something very different, but they must come out with an alternative set of analysis to combat that. I think otherwise one is talking in abstract and nothing much other than rhetorics can come out of it. And I think that, and the last but not the least, there is also scope to include development financial institutions, change the tax regimes, and think about alternative and better ways of financing government expenditure that would be consistent both with economic recovery and compensation of labor.
All right, Dhiraj, take that. Dhiraj?
No, my point is simple. The government is terrible at imposing you. The only way the government would have a revenue stream from these projects or these things, if it keeps them, is if it imposes reasonable user fee. Now we know from railways to ports, to roads, whether it's water, power distribution, the government nowhere can impose in India a reasonable user fee for obvious reasons. And I don't necessarily blame them also, because we are a political democracy and our primary demand as a political democracy has been for redistributive measures. We want this free, we want that reserved. We are not a growth-oriented voter, right? So that's the way the government would respond. So there's no question of the government generating a revenue stream. If it goes to the private sector, on the other hand, there will be a revenue stream. There will be some amount of profitability, because that's the way the private sector works. It has to make a profit to survive. The government doesn't need to. Government can run years of losses and in the end, either tax us or print money or do whatever else it wants. But the private sector doesn't have that option. So I think it's the principle for me that that these assets are terribly underutilized in the government. The returns that you could get from them are completely missing in the government system, and therefore, whether it's public sector companies or these other assets, they should be leased. In fact, hotels, that's another classic case. If, for example, you don't want, what is the main worry, Barkha? To be frank, the main worry is that you're maybe giving land away for free, large amounts of land to a private sector. But the point is that you have to keep the land, lease the thing. That's why, and let them monetize. Let the private sector build a good hotel where Ashoka is in Delhi, and actually get return on that land. Because right now there is no return on that land. That's the point. These assets, whether it's land, building, railways, we are not getting any returns on it, and therefore the private sector needs to operate and manage.
But I've been hearing about this divestment process, and I think Sunil, Dhiraj makes a good point that we're not even really talking about divestment here. We're talking about a lease where the government remains the owner. And Centaur, we spoke about divestment of Centaur, what, about a decade ago or maybe more, when Arun Shourie was still with the NDA. Sunil, your last thoughts?
Look, I mean, there are enough people who will come and say the government may or may not do this. I mean, like Gilbert has said, every time I find the key to success, somebody comes and puts a lock on it. And Rahul Gandhi has to stop behaving like that, because we have to give the private sector a chance. Everywhere in the world, as Gurucharan has said, that look, the private sector makes a much better evaluation every time they get in there. Every 3 months, they've got to produce the results. The shareholders ask for the results. We can carry on the government forever. And I think it's important, because the government does need the money now for the poor fundamentally, and to develop infrastructure. And they are going to get the money, and obviously they're not going to keep it in their coffers and use it in the manner in which people are now saying, or at least the ones who oppose it are saying they must use it correctly. Obviously, this government will, and that's the way I look at it.
Okay, Mitali, since you don't disagree with this in principle, your concern seems to be more about safeguards and how the money will be used.
Yes, absolutely, Barkha. Not disagreeing in principle with disinvestment as a strategy to raise finances for government spending. However, it would be appropriate to have checks and balances built in contracting. Also, it's very important, we haven't talked about this today, but climate resilient infrastructure, I keep talking about it because we are facing an existential threat. And these contracts are going to be 20, 30-year-long contracts. So how are we building green principles and sustainability principles and holding the private sector accountable within those contracts?
But I mean, surely the public sector is as accountable for that as the private sector is. That's not a private versus public debate.
Yeah, so but then it has to be built into the contracts now that the private sector will be taking them over. And
Okay,
we need to have that situation, because it's our future at stake, for the young people of this country.
Gurucharan, any red flags apart from the one you flagged in the beginning of the show, which is that this may not take off because of past experiences?
Yeah. Well, I think let's look, since we have raised the question of what we'll do with the money. I want to just underline the point that Dhiraj has made with first principles. What is the first principle for a finance minister or for the economy in India? And that is to create jobs. We want to lift people out of poverty by creating jobs, not by giving them doles, like the food security kind of pricing, etc., that we have. We want to be able to lift them up so they don't need those sort of protections. If we want to create jobs, infrastructure is the tried and tested way to do it. Now, the jobs there are, if you broaden the definition of infrastructure, you can also have social infrastructure. Education and health also create lots of jobs. So that should be also included. But the overall point should be that here we are still a young country, unlike China. We still have opportunity to compete with young people, and let's not miss the boat again. Our manufacturing boat, we seem to have missed. Okay. Now, in the services area. So I would just say infrastructure. In fact, if to argue against Mitali, I would just say that I would earmark these. This is actually what Sita Raman said, that I would earmark the returns from this money for more infrastructure. For more jobs. I wouldn't use this to give away money for other purposes.
Okay, this is going to be an ongoing debate. I think the first thing to see is what are the safeguards in the contracts to avoid monopolies, which is something we all agree on, and whether there's enough receding by government to make it incentive worthy for the private players. Leaving it there, Mitali, Zico, Sunil, Gurucharan, and Dhiraj, thank you. And to our audience, thanks as ever for watching. See you tomorrow, same time, same place. Goodbye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.